many people have described to me this principle called aversion practice, which was held up within OneTaste as a way to get more personal growth, to understand yourself better, to reach more sexual and spiritual enlightenment. And the way that aversion practice worked is that it basically taught that if you did acts that you felt an aversion to, you would gain more spiritual liberation.
It's a critical component to mind control. Being made over to be clones of the person who's at the top of the pyramid. Interested in the subject because of my own cult involvement. I was recruited in 1974 into a front group of the Moonies.
Hello, I'm Dr. Stephen Hassan with another episode of my podcast, Cults, Culture, and Coercion. And I have a author of a new book out. I want to say Ellen Huet and I talked years ago when she was an investigative journalist for Bloomberg News and Bloomberg Business Week. But she has a brand new book out called Empire of Orgasm, which is about a cult that I know about because former victims came to me and were asking me, what did I think? And did I think it was a cult? And isn't it cool that people are having orgasms? And I had to try to parse out what is going on here with this group. Anyway, Ellen, the leader has gone to jail, and we're going to talk about that. But Ellen, you have 2 seasons of a podcast, Foundering, a narrative audio series for Bloomberg Technology. One season recounts the rise and fall of WeWork. Another one chronicles the story of OpenAI and analyzes the trustworthiness of its leader, Sam Altman. We should do more of another interview because I want to hear more about that too. But we're talking about OneTaste now. And if you haven't seen it, Netflix did a series that featured Ellen and her work in 2022 called Orgasm, Inc. And Ellen has been cited in the New York Times, New Yorker, Wall Street Journal, Vanity Fair, just a few other places. And before you started at Bloomberg, you were at Forbes and a crime reporter at the San Francisco Chronicle. And you have this interest in writing about strange and complex subcultures. And I wonder if it's because you live in San Francisco Bay Area. I doubt it. But anyway, welcome. And how you doing? And I hope the book's doing great.
I'm doing great. And yeah, it feels really good to have the book out in the world because it was a big project, a real passion project of mine. And yeah, it really warms my heart to see people getting to read it. And I've started to hear from readers, and that has been really gratifying.
Yes. So where do we want to start? Do we want to start how you got interested in the topic?
Well, let me give a little background about
Please.
OneTaste and orgasmic meditation, because it does require a little bit of explanation before people can really understand how to get into the nitty-gritty of the topic. So, right, so the book, my newest book is called Empire of Orgasm, and it tells the definitive story of this company, OneTaste, which was founded in San Francisco in 2004 by a woman named Nicole Daedone. And she's really like the visionary and the leader, both technically, like she was the CEO for many years, and then also kind of spiritually, she's like the spiritual leader of this group. And OneTaste is, on its surface, a sexual wellness education company, kind of like a startup. And they sold courses on a practice that they popularized and developed called Orgasmic meditation. And Orgasmic meditation is a 15-minute partnered clitoral stroking mindfulness practice in which a stroker, usually a man who remains fully clothed, puts on a glove and some lube on his left index finger, and he strokes the clitoris of a woman who is naked from the waist down for 15 minutes exactly in a pretty prescribed manner. And the purpose, the goal for both parties during this practice is to feel the sensations in their body and to kind of meditate on and notice the sensations in their body. So that's really the basics. And the promise of orgasmic meditation, which OneTaste also referred to as OM or OM, maybe similar to like the mantra that you might hear like in a yoga studio or something like that. OneTaste would say that the promise of OM was that if you did this practice regularly, it would improve your sex life, your relationships, your sense of vitality, your connection with your desire and your own intuition. And even if you became a more advanced practitioner, your sense of connection to the divine and to a life force that they liked to call orgasm with a capital O. So maybe similar to other wellness groups, it was promising that if you did this regular practice, that you would have a better life, not just physically, but also spiritually and emotionally. And yeah, they started off in San Francisco, but eventually had offices in LA, New York, Austin, London, Australia. They did really expand pretty widely. And orgasmic meditation was endorsed by some of the biggest names in wellness, including Gwyneth Paltrow, as well as Khloe Kardashian, Tim Ferriss, and others like that. So even though it's a bit of a fringe practice, it did get fairly mainstream. And I'll just pause there because that's kind of the basics.
Well, let me just say, when I was first shown the book of Daedone and former victims started coming to me saying they read Combating Cult Mind Control and they think it's a cult and what do I think? And I showed them my bite model and they started ticking off all the boxes of my bite model of authoritarian control. I was like, And then I started thinking, I remember when I was helping people in the Rajneesh Osho cult, where he was massaging the third eye and giving women orgasms because he was like Jesus and Buddha, etc. And then I was thinking about the Children of God trafficking cult where they were molesting children and sending women out to be hookers. And just I started going through the list of other abusive sexual cults. So back to you.
Well, I mean, it seems like if there's one thing I've learned, and I'm curious if you agree, it does seem like many high demand groups control their members' sexuality in some way, whether that is arranging partnerships or prescribing celibacy, or in some cases, like at OneTaste, suggesting that having sex with many people within the group would be a way to gain spiritual enlightenment. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. And some cults say your sexuality is a hindrance, like the Heaven's Gate cult. They said we were alien. They were aliens in human bodies. So the guys had their testicles removed. At least 8 of them did, of the group that wound up committing self-homicide from being in a cult. But I've been doing this work for almost 50 years, and it just seems like part of human experience is our sexual identity and our sexual energy. And for me, I was a nice Jewish boy from Queens, and I loved sex, and when I met the Moonies, and I met them with women flirting with me, thinking that I'd have a girlfriend, not understanding that even thinking about sex or holding a woman was like evil, and that I was going to be put in a mass wedding and stuff. My point is I spent age 19 to almost 22 never masturbating. Like I was totally unable to be sexual and that was part of the brainwashing, was that I was alienated against my true nature and told to not trust my body at all.
Well, that makes me think of two things. One is that, yes, I've also been told that, part of why a cult wants to control your sexuality, whether that's in like suggesting promiscuity or celibacy or arranged partnerships, is that in controlling your sexuality, because it's such an intimate part of a person, it allows that level of control to deepen. Like if you have given over autonomy of your sexuality to a leader or like an authority, then that deepens your sense of devotion to the group. One of the things that I hope Empire of Orgasm makes clear to its readers is that we should have a lot of compassion and understanding for why people wanted to join OneTaste, in part because, like you mentioned, humans all desire to understand their sexuality. It is something that is really deeply hardwired into us, that this is like an important part of who we are. And for a lot of people, it's something where maybe if they have questions or struggles, it's not always clear where to go to get guidance, or to seek answers. And OneTaste came along and basically suggested, like, hey, if you follow our path, you're going to get answers to your sexuality. So, I like to tell people, imagine all the different kinds of people that might have appealed to. For example, some research suggests that 10 to 15% of American women struggle to have an orgasm. Lots of people struggle with performance anxiety during sex, whether men or women. And then plenty of people are in relationships where they're still really committed to the person, but the physical spark is gone, or there's something about their sex life that is not working. And, especially in today's society, it's like, where are you going to go to get really candid answers about that? Part of what made OneTaste so appealing is that they were unabashed about saying this is a place where you can get answers to your sexual problems, where you can not just fix them, but you can really elevate your sex life to be this thriving force in your day-to-day experience.
Right. And they were adding the spiritual dimension, connecting the dots with meditation and your higher self and that sort of thing for sure. But I need to mention we're doing this interview the end of 2025 when Christian nationalism and trafficking is all over the news and abuse and such. There's just so many people who were raised in this extremist religious environments, whether Jewish, Christian, or Muslim, where there was no sex education, where there's homophobia, where there's just profound ignorance. They get kicked out or they get disillusioned. They don't have a source of information that makes sense. And typically they meet somebody who says, come and check this out, or I'm going to check this out.
Yeah.
It should be fun, or it will be different. But I want to just add, because I work with so many people who are in the Rajneesh Osho cult. In that cult, they were like, leave your shoes and your mind outside the ashram. And if somebody approached you and wanted to have intercourse with you and you didn't want to do it, that was a sign you were too much in your ego. And spirit wants you to have sex, whether it's a guy or a girl, whether you're a gay or a hetero, whatever. So this, and to your point, the breaking down of boundaries is in a physical way, gets into our emotional space as well as our heart and our sense of self.
Yeah, there was a concept that one of the experts I spoke to for the book talked about, this idea of like taboo minimization. Like if you join a group and maybe you're interested in what they have to offer, but there's an activity that you feel is like a little confronting, if the group manages to persuade you to do it, then the effect of that is that further acts that you then also find taboo, like you might be more open to kind of changing your mind about it. And it can be this gradual experience of changing your boundaries.
You're mentioning a key part of what I've learned from studying brainwashing and cognitive dissonance and everything else is if you can make changes in behavior, we rationalize, we justify, we bend to make it okay, to emotionally make it congruent with us. Yeah. So the idea of group participation, people are modeling the new behavior up there, they're giving you all the pros, they're identifying if you have resistances, why it would be beneficial for you to overcome it. But, in my line of work, Ellen, people who are traumatized come to me. I don't typically hear from people who are like, this was the best thing. And if they are, they've been sent for PR purposes to try to get me to change my mind that the group isn't deleterious.
Yeah.
But that brings up another point I want to say, which is that, groups are on a continuum. And depending on where you are in the pyramid or whether you're a fringe member, you can have a dramatically different experience than someone else who's in the same group. And you have no clue what was going on as a staff member, for example, or behind the scenes with the guru and how she, in this case, was treating people.
Yeah. Well, maybe it would make sense to have me give a little background as to how I became involved in this story or what my introduction to this topic is. So,
please.
I'm a journalist. I've spent my whole career working as a reporter, and I have worked at Bloomberg News for a long time. And back in 2017, when I was working at Bloomberg in San Francisco, I was covering startups. And so at the time, I was covering companies like WeWork and Uber and Lyft. That was kind of the startup boom in Silicon Valley. And I received a pitch, as I do many times a day. And this one was about OneTaste, this wellness startup selling orgasmic meditation. It's run by women. And the pitch was essentially like, yeah, we're an interesting business. Would you like to come and learn more about us? And I had vaguely heard of orgasmic meditation before, but I wasn't that familiar with it. But it's obviously an eye-catching subject. And so I was curious. So basically, I had a meeting with the people who ran OneTaste at the time, and they kind of gave me the basic pitch, which is like, this is what orgasmic meditation can do for your life. We're like the Whole Foods of sexuality, the organic, good for you version of sexuality. Here's what we're all about. And at the same time, I went to do some reporting on my own, and I ended up talking to people who told me a really different story, who had been involved in OneTaste as customers or employees, and they basically said, actually, the public story about OneTaste is incomplete. Like, yes, this practice has helped a lot of people. And at the same time, if you are one of the people who get more involved in the company, they were saying that they had had experiences that were really predatory and that were really damaging. And they said that they had been pressured to take on debt in order to buy more and more expensive courses, and that they felt like they'd been pressured to have sex with customers, other employees, an investor, in order to help keep the business running. And some of them called it a dangerous cult. And I was pretty shocked and started to do some more reporting and ended up writing an investigative story about it in 2018, which in all likelihood set in motion a few things. I mean, the company went into a bit of a hibernation. They closed some of their centers, had a little bit of a leadership change. And a few months after that story came out, I heard from some of my sources that the FBI was starting to investigate this company, that FBI agents were showing up at the doors of some of my sources and asking them, what happened at OneTaste? Can you sit down? Can you talk to us? They were having long conversations about what had transpired at this company. And, to zoom ahead several years, that investigation went on for several years. And then in 2023, federal prosecutors indicted Nicole Daedone, the leader of the group, and Rachel Churwitz, her second in command, with one charge of forced labor conspiracy. And then after 2 years of kind of pretrial proceedings, there was a trial this summer in New York in which Nicole and Rachel were both found guilty. And they are currently in jail awaiting sentencing, which it's actually maybe unlikely that'll happen this year, but it seems more likely early next year.
Yeah, so people contacted me who had been staff members and described that very same kind of abuse and control and phobias and threats and money exploitation, etc. And, I did my doctoral dissertation on how to use trafficking law, which is fraud, force, or coercion, to apply to cults, and using my BITE model, and I did a quantitative study on it, because the law doesn't get, undue influence yet in terms of that it's a dissociative disorder and how the mind can get hacked and how people can get reprogrammed with beliefs and memories that they never had before, etc., and undue influence. And at least one of the people that came to me for assistance was very upset and was exploring lawyers and what legal action civilly could be taken. And I know from my experience with Nexium, which wound up sending Keith Raniere to jail for 120 years for trafficking, the lawyer that I talked with said, if we can get the feds to do the heavy lifting, then we hold off on the civil litigation for them to prove the criminal thing, and we use that information to then pursue civil litigation. So it's just a strategy that for survivors, how to get their money back or the damages. A lot of people really needed therapy from their experiences. But I have to just say, I just learned as we're recording this an hour before that a man who's involved with Scientology, and there was an 8-week jury trial, and this was just plain financial exploitation and fraud and of investors, etc. He just got a pardon from Trump.
Oh, wow.
He was sentenced to years, 7 years in jail. I think he was in for a few weeks and he got pardoned, but because he had connections with Scientology, which makes me go, oh my God, rule of law, what's happening to America? This sucks. And so we're glad there was a positive decision with Daedone and the assistant, because it's really a crime to abuse human beings.
Yeah, it's interesting, all the stuff you just said, because there was a little bit of civil litigation that seems to have started. There are several different cases, like OneTaste has actually sued one or two former employees of theirs, and then it does seem like there were the beginnings of something akin to a class action suit. I won't specifically call it that because I'm not sure if it got that certification, but from former members trying to allege civil claims against OneTaste. But it's true that it does appear that some of that litigation was kind of put on hold or not prioritized while the criminal trial was advancing. And what's interesting is, Nicole and Rachel were out on bail for the 2 years between when they were charged and when they were convicted this summer. But the day after the verdict, there was a bail hearing and the judge actually revoked bail. And that was when Nicole and Rachel were taken into custody. So they're currently being held in a federal jail in Brooklyn. And there has been this interesting shift in OneTaste's media strategy in the last year since Trump got reelected, in which they have generally been receiving favorable coverage in conservative media. And they've been seeking, I wouldn't say endorsements because it's not quite officially an endorsement, but for example, like Roger Stone has voiced his support for the defense. There are various people who have, Trump affiliations. OneTaste has actually paid for coverage in Revolver News, which I believe has a Trump connection. And although they have not said anything specific about seeking a pardon, I think it's fair to say that their actions in the last year have potentially made that an easier sell. And at one point, Jennifer Bonjean, who was Nicole's defense attorney, was asked, actually this was right after the guilty verdict, she was asked, are you seeking a pardon? And I believe she said something like, I'll always take a pardon. And so they're not really saying much about what their strategy is officially, but I wouldn't be surprised if that's something that is on their strategy roadmap.
Money. And, the bad actors, they don't want the public to know about brainwashing or cults. They just don't. They don't like all of these Epstein victims coming forward. And it's just because there really is a conspiracy of crime that appears to be happening right now in our country. It's very disillusioning, but us whistleblowers and truth tellers like yourself do our best to go with the facts and say, look, walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, feathers like a duck. Let's look at why we think it's a duck, Your Honor. Please give us an example or two of some of the stories that might help illuminate a little bit more.
Totally. I'll give you a little bit of a more background about some of the things that happened within OneTaste. Essentially, the company had two layers to it. There was this outward-facing kind of like wellness, mainstream-ish business in which they were selling courses about orgasmic meditation and doing, honestly, similar things that a startup might in the 2010s. So Nicole, for example, spoke on stage at a TEDx conference. She spoke at South by Southwest. Her TED Talk has been viewed 2 million times on YouTube. OneTaste hosted conferences in San Francisco in which they gathered people together for 3 days of learning about orgasmic meditation. culminating in both a group orgasmic meditation session in which a bunch of pairs did the practice all together simultaneously, and then also Nicole doing a demonstration on stage in which she stroked one of her deputies as a demonstration of like how powerful orgasmic meditation can be. And so they really had this like glossy exterior.
Mm-hmm.
And then for those who got more involved in the company, it was a deeper and more immersive experience. And again, this is where more people allege that there was cult-like dynamics within the group. And what that pattern often looked like was, let's say you were someone who heard about OneTaste and were intrigued, and you went to one of their introductory group evenings where, you know, everyone stays fully clothed, but you might play some communication games and learn a little bit about the orgasmic meditation philosophy and how it can change your life. And you meet these nice people and they seem really interested in you and they're very friendly and they invite you to come back for another course. And so for a lot of people who ended up getting more involved that way, what ended up happening to those people was they would move out of their old home and then move into one of a number of communal OM residences that were sometimes officially run by OneTaste, but more often they were informal and you would live with other OM practitioners or OneTaste staff. And you might leave your job and start working for OneTaste instead. Often you would work on the sales team because the main source of revenue for the company was selling these more and more expensive courses as a way of bringing in revenue for the company. And gradually you would kind of distance yourself from your friends and family who didn't really understand this new orgasmic path that you were on. And you would start spending all your time with people at OneTaste. And, you know, orgasmic meditation as the practice was the front door, but the more involved you got, it was more like, okay, orgasm with a capital O becomes this life force that you are working toward having a deeper connection with in your life. And that might look like doing the OM practice many times a day, but also kind of dedicating your life to spreading the word of orgasm to the world. And, you know, for a while, OneTaste's mission statement was to bring orgasm to 1 billion people. And they really had, in some ways, some of the same trappings as a startup, but in other ways, more of this like personal transformation business. I think people might recognize similar business models as like Tony Robbins or Landmark, this idea that you might pay $20,000 or $30,000 to take a seminar that is going to change or improve your life. You know, for a lot of people, these courses did have benefit. And at the same time, for some members of OneTaste, it was a way that also like deepened their ties to the company, because if you were an employee, you were like selling these courses to other people, but you were also taking them yourself. So you were also paying money to your employer in order to like take these courses. And so for a lot of people who got very involved, OneTaste quickly became their whole world, right? It was like all your friends, your roommates, your home, your work, your source of connection to the divine, like your entire social network. And within that world, there was like a philosophy, according to the people who were there, of pretty extreme acts in order to, again, further your personal growth or further your like orgasmic path. And so often those extreme acts were sexual. And so there was this culture in which people were pressured to have sex with coworkers, potential customers as a way to keep the business going. And they explained to me that there was philosophies that helped reinforce those beliefs. So earlier you talked about how, you know, I don't want to misstate it, but that within the Osho group that they were, you know, if you showed resistance to something, then there was a response that the leaders could say that would try to brush aside your resistance. And that struck me because there was something similar within OneTaste. So many people have described to me this principle called aversion practice, which was held up within OneTaste as a way to, again, get more personal growth, to understand yourself better, to reach more sexual and spiritual enlightenment. And the way that aversion practice worked is that it basically taught that if you did acts that you felt an aversion to, you would gain more spiritual liberation. And the more of an aversion you felt, the more liberation you would get if you did them anyway.
Exactly.
So this could apply both to non-sexual situations, but was often applied to sexual situations. So many people describe to me, for example, if you were like a female OneTaste employee and there was a man who was interested in taking a course that involved doing the OM practice, but he didn't have a partner, it might be suggested or strongly suggested that you pair up with the customer so that he will buy the course and then you are his own partner. And this means that he's going to touch your genitals. And for people who said no, sometimes they were told you should do it anyway because of your aversion practice. It's going to help with your aversion practice.
Right.
And and many women described this to me, and they also told me that, if you said no, you might get shamed for having a quote unquote golden pussy. And excuse my language, but within OneTaste, they did use the words pussy and cock.
My podcast is very liberal in terms of word choices.
Within the world of OneTaste, they chose to use the words pussy and cock to describe male and female genitalia because they liked the emotional charge that came with it. I think they thought it was like a way to confront some of those pent-up feelings that we often have about our sexuality. So anyway, you might get shamed for having a golden pussy, which was a bad thing. It was basically saying like, oh, you think you are too good to be touched by this person that's so stuck up of you. Within OneTaste, people also described to me getting assignments from people higher up, sometimes Nicole, sometimes others, that were phrased as and framed as a way to, again, get more personal growth, but might also function to like just increase the exchange of sex within the community. So women described to me often getting assignments like, oh, your orgasm seems really blocked up these days. You should have sex with 30 different people in the next 30 days, or you should give 30 different blowjobs in the next 30 days. Often they were like 30 days long, and it would involve a lot of sexual activity. And some women described to me how ashamed they felt if they like gave up halfway through the assignment. There was a lot of sense of wanting to do things that were extreme because you knew that you would get approval from the powers that be within the group and wanting to avoid certain things that you knew would get disapproval. There was one particular example of a sexual arrangement within OneTaste that became an important focus of the criminal case, which is that in the early days of OneTaste, the company was struggling to make money and they were losing money every year. And one of the ways that they managed to stay in business is that Nicole met a Silicon Valley investor named Reese Jones. And the two of them started dating, and he was very interested in OneTaste, and he was interested in supporting the company. And so he would lend the company money. He paid for some business expenses. And in exchange, according to people who were there, as well as court testimony, he was repaid in sexual experiences. So that looked like either these elaborate BDSM scenes in which OneTaste employees would put on these kind of like immersive sexual theater experiences for him for his birthday. They were themed after, for example, The Wizard of Oz or The Seven Deadly Sins. And there were also a series of women who were OneTaste employees who were asked to be his sexual handler. And to be his handler meant something like living with him, taking care of some housework, maybe taking care of his dog, and then also giving him a sexual service every day. So often people have described both in court and to me that looked like a hand job or something similar. But essentially, his sexual needs were met in exchange for his financial support of the company. And what's interesting is, some of the women who have held this role are still really devoted members of OneTaste. And others feel like it was something that they agreed to under coercion and pressure.
They were trafficked. At least that's how it looks.
I mean, the prosecutors did not use that word, so I'll be careful about that one. But
I get it.
But it's complicated. And I think
labor trafficked.
Yeah, they were made to feel like it was a position of honor within the community. But of course, someone looking from the outside might see it very differently.
Yeah. Yeah, so let's touch on the people who, even though the leader goes to jail and is found guilty, they still believe.
Yeah, well, Nicole's a fascinating character. She's at this point in her late 50s. She's very charismatic and compelling. I recently looked at the sentencing. There's been a lot of court paperwork in advance of the sentencing, including many, something like 200 letters in support of Nicole about how much she has changed their lives and how much good she's done for the world. There are lots of people who support her, despite there being also people who have been, quite clear that they feel like she has abused and exploited them. And she, I think like many leaders in her position, she commands a lot of loyalty and intrigue. And she's definitely someone who has lived a life of extremes and for whom that is kind of like how she attracts people into her group. So when she was young, she had a very complicated childhood. She grew up in the Bay Area in the 70s and was raised by a single mom and often wished to be much closer to her father, who was not that present in her life. He had had other spouses and other children. And she has spoken at length about how her father was a convicted child sex abuser. He was incarcerated twice for crimes related to child sex abuse, both when she was young, like under 10 years old, and again when she was in her 20s. And he actually died while in custody when she was in her late 20s. And so was never actually convicted of a charge the second time. But she has spoken about how her father's like dark relationship to sexuality inspired her to want to show that sexuality could also heal. But what makes this more complicated is, she has often sidestepped the question of whether her father abused her.
I was going to ask my listeners, I'm sure, are wondering.
Well, and his later victims, the times when Nicole was in her 20s, included there were several victims. One of which was his young granddaughter, who was like a preteen at the time, and. So the question of whether Nicole's father ever abused her is something that I do try to answer in the book. It is obviously a really sensitive question and something that I try to treat with care and responsibility. But I did find people who told me that when Nicole was younger, but like before she was as much in the public eye, she had told them that her father had abused her when she was a child. And then later, a bit more complicatedly, she has reframed that story at times such that she is playing a role of instigating this type of relationship with her father, when keep in mind she's a child in this retelling.
Right.
And so, if you speak to experts on child sex abuse, they will say that this is actually fairly common, that people might reframe stories of sexual abuse that happened when they were minors in order to put themselves in a position of agency, despite how complicated that might be. And I think what it has led to is a couple things. First of all, when Nicole would talk about this part of her past to people who were interested in OneTaste, it allowed her to project this image of someone who had been through dark, traumatic sexual experiences and had emerged as this like enlightened person. And so for a lot of people who had a complicated sexual history, that was very appealing. This idea that their leader might have figured out how to overcome really difficult things in her sexual past, and that if they followed in her footsteps, they would be able to do the same. And the other is that it seems to have framed in her mind a sense that there is kind of no right or wrong. Like she has spoken in lectures about how she never took on the idea that her father was a bad person. And then instead he was this like expansive person on the fourth dimension who was just like too expansive for the laws of the third dimension. And I think what's interesting there is broadly within Buddhism, there is a sense of like non-judgment or, the feeling of like taking in, noticing things without ascribing like good or bad to them. Like there is value to that idea. And yet, like in some cases, I think Nicole's teachings often take a good idea and then take it too far. And so, there was just like ended up being this, the deeper you got in OneTaste, there were also these like more complex philosophies about like, good and evil and the ways of the world. And it sounds like you have something you want to add.
As a therapist of people who've been in all of these different abusive groups, I think Landmark Forum was brought up. That was Werner Erhard, Jack Rosenberg, who was in Scientology, created EST, etc. This notion that there's no good or evil, and that if you got raped as a child, you created that experience for your soul. So rather than take a victim role, you have to understand why you manifested this experience for yourself.
Yeah.
And it negates the whole notion of undue influence, that somebody lied to you and systematically tricked you and violated your boundaries and took advantage of your money and your body for their purpose. And so I just say crock of shit when I hear models like that of, we have to go beyond judgment and all of that. It's
Well,
like,
it's interesting, both the sense of there being no victims, or that the idea that you should reject victim mentality, as well as the idea that you should be 100% responsible for your experience. Both of those ideas were quite central to some of the teachings of OneTaste. And those are ideas that, as you know and I know, those show up in many, many different forms in different groups. And within
but they're
OneTaste,
very convenient for abusive mind control cults.
Yeah.
Because, if there's no such thing as a victim, then there's no such thing as a perpetrator.
Yeah.
So if Trump says women love it when I grab them by the genitals, the women made him grab them. It wasn't that he wanted to abuse them and they wanted nothing to do with him. Right.
Yeah.
And it's just, we really have to come back to common sense and like what is normal, healthy human development, and the notion that there really are victims. People walk across the street, someone's drunk and they go through a red light and they hit you. You didn't create them getting drunk to hit you. Or if you're a child and your father's molesting you, that was a crime. And most people who are assaulted, and I think the numbers are something like 1 in 4 women and 1 in 6 boys, you have a sexual assault. So the numbers are extraordinarily high, at least in the United States. For women who've been assaulted, to see a woman who was assaulted trying to take I've evolved past all of that, I would imagine would be very alluring and
really
motivating on a certain level, right?
Yeah. One thing I was surprised and saddened to learn over the course of my reporting about OneTaste was, OneTaste attracted people of all walks of life, and people who, had healthy childhoods and those who had more difficult ones. But it's true that, I spoke to many men and women who had experienced some sort of sexual assault or sexual abuse when they were children, or some sort of complicated past sexual trauma that really felt like extra drawn to OneTaste, because there was this unspoken promise that this is a place where that can be healed. And so I felt, and I was moved to realize just, how common it is. Like, we really don't talk about child sex abuse, but it happens a lot. And I think that, again, this is one of those ways where people were perhaps extra vulnerable to OneTaste if they felt like there weren't that many other places that they could go to seek guidance on this.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But most people who've been abused don't go on to become abusers. And, but there is a small percentage, and the idea, at least as a psychotherapist, is identification with the aggressor, that there's a part of your psyche that wants to enact, in an effort to heal what was done in your childhood, to enact it on other people, except it's not a healing at all. And it's part of this kind of mutation of abuse that can spread over generations. And it's really tragic.
Yeah. And a lot of people who I spoke to who had been very involved in OneTaste, after they left the group, had to process, and I imagine this is similar for people in other groups that you've spoken to, but had to come to grips with this idea that maybe I was a victim. But within OneTaste, the idea of becoming a victim was so denigrated and really seen as like a small-minded and really just like a bad mentality to have, that it often took a lot for people. It was quite painful for people to then, after leaving the group, decide to identify as a victim. Like, it still felt very complicated for them and quite painful. And then, of course, for many of them, they had to reassess and reprocess their relationship to their sexuality, because they had been in an environment where their usual sexual boundaries and their usual sexual behavior had been very different. Like, they would do, for most people involved in OneTaste, the daily routine was wake up, do 2 different sessions of orgasmic meditation, with 2 different partners in the morning. Maybe you might do more throughout the day or have sex with other people, and then you would do 2 more sessions in the evening. Like, it's just very different from the sexual behavior that is the norm outside the group. And so there's a lot of difficult processing that was required after people even took that difficult step of leaving.
Right. But again, I'll just add, as a therapist, in my experience, it's so important when people come through an experience like it with this group to deconstruct what beliefs got imprinted in your brain. And part of that is you have to go back in time before you met the group, hang out with family and friends, read your journals. And it's like, what was my identity?
Yeah.
What did I think I was getting into? And these beliefs that were in phobias that were put in my head. And I really do think that this notion about being a victim is a phobia. I think of multi-level marketing cults that say a job is evil, like you're a failure if you have a salary, like you have to become an independent salesperson for the MLM pyramid scheme or something.
Yeah.
But you have to reprocess. Job does not equal evil. Being a victim doesn't mean you're lower than or there's something wrong with you.
Yeah.
And it's about framing and perspective. And again, as a therapist, I want to give people tools I want people to be functional. I want you to have meaningful relationships, meaningful work. I want you to basically have a good relationship with yourself and others. And there are principles of health. What are healthy boundaries and what are not healthy boundaries? And, as a therapist, I think sexuality is something so precious and special. And of course, to make a joke, to quote Woody Allen, masturbation is sex with the one that I love. But I had to get over my phobia as a Moonie that self-pleasuring wasn't demons invading my mind. And this was like a normal biological function. Or having a nocturnal dream was not, demonic possession. But you really have to reprogram your mind and come back to this is how the body works. These are what hormones are. And the specialness of being with a human being who's an autonomous human being that says, I want to share my body with you and have pleasure with you and help you have orgasms, and you can help me have orgasms. The specialness of that, and to say, we need to have 2 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon, and we'll tell you, we need the income. Let's look at the numbers. How many did you bring in this week? Is just opposite the human healthy experience.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that kept me so interested in this group is the complexity of it. Like there were genuinely things about the orgasmic meditation practice that people found really valuable. Like the idea that there was no goal beyond just feeling the sensations in your body for those 15 minutes. That can be very freeing for someone who has struggled with performance anxiety or feeling like sex always needs to have some sort of goal, or like you have to reach somewhere for it to be good. And so what is often lamented by people who were really involved in OneTaste is that some of the goodness of the practice has really just been inexorably wrapped up with what they see as the deeply harmful parts of the company that was popularizing it. And, I imagine this is true in your research as well. But, for a lot of these groups, of course, there's teachings of value at the center. Otherwise, they just wouldn't get off the ground.
And kernels of genuine positive experience. And like I fasted for 7 days twice with just water, working normal days. I'd never do it again, but I know that I did it, and I know what my body felt like, and I know that I can survive not eating for 7 days. But, and so in a way it's made me stronger, but I'd never recommend it again. But honestly, it's like you really need to re-experience life after cult And with folks who were in groups where sex was evil, it took me a year before I could kiss a woman on the lips and not hear the lectures in my head from the Moonies. And I was a lecturer, so I was delivering them too. And when you're in a sex cult, having like sex once a week with a partner is like a big, shift that needs to happen. But it's, I think, a necessary thing to come back to, ground zero and not just react from what you had the experience in the cult, but kind of like what's really healthy for me and such. Yeah, and taking the good stuff and getting rid of the bad stuff. And people ask me about the Moonies and did you get anything good out of it, Steve? It's like I was an introvert, and I was trained to go up on stage and talk to 1,000 people, and I became a public speaker as a result of being in the Moonies.
Yeah.
So,
well, I had something I wanted to bring up, which I remember talking about in our conversation when I called you, I guess at this point years ago, to interview you for this book, which is talking about how cults are going to change in the future and how these leaders are going to look different, because I think in some ways Nicole Daedone doesn't fit the stereotypical image that some people might have of a cult leader. Like, she's a woman. OneTaste was like a very glossy, like startup looking wellness company. And, I think if there's one thing I've observed, it's that these groups adapt with the times, and today they're probably going to look more online than before. I feel like you're seeing groups that are, alleged to be cults that are also like YouTube communities or like Instagram influencers. That's what I've seen. But is that something that you feel like your audience? I don't know. Have you talked about that with your audience and the idea that more of these leaders could be women in the future too?
Right. So let me just say I grew up in the age of women burning their bras and joining the workforce and, women's liberation. I have 2 older sisters, so I'm all for, women having rights. And now with the Trump cult wanting to do trad wives and make women back in an old, servile role of baby making and housekeeping and such. I'm aghast at that. And there have been more women cult leaders who have emerged, many of whom were raised in cultic environments themselves. And that's, again, part of what I see as the mutation effect, that it got into your head, you never processed it properly, and you're enacting some of your indoctrination and such. So that's one piece of what I see evolving. I literally was recording a video this morning about AI and the fear of AI becoming a god, and Jeffrey Hinton, who won a Nobel laureate as one of the architects of AI, was saying AI should have a maternal instinct, because if it has a maternal instinct, then it will be more protective of us than a male, someone on the spectrum kind of identity, which is what we're seeing now with all of the digital social media titans, the rewiring of neurotypical brains to being more neuroatypical, and more hours inhabiting our phones or being on computer is rewiring our brain. Our attention span is going down. But we're in the moment of psychological warfare. That's my thesis with the cult of Trump, where bad actors, state actors like Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, Nazis, Christian nationalists want there to be anxiety, fear, They want people to hate each other and be polarized. So we're in an environment now where adding in the AI piece with deep fakes and such, I'm just seeing a lot of algorithmic radicalization, making people more extreme on the left, more extreme on the right. And what's it gonna do to the Moonies? What's it gonna do to other cults that had been brick and mortar cults versus new mutation cults that are based on, hey, ChatGPT, create a cult for ideology for me based on this, and this, and prompt for this, so we can recruit these types of people. It's like, holy crap. Yo, everybody, warning.
Yeah.
Seriously, be in your body, be in real life, have trustworthy friends, and reality test the whole lot. So, I'm sorry
I
if
recently...
that was too much, but...
No, it's fine. I think one of the things that I took away from our conversation that feels very relevant to OneTaste is this idea that, the archetype of a cult leader might change, and this idea that, I think in the early days of OneTaste, people looked at a woman leading OneTaste with Nicole as the leader and thought, oh, this is like more trustworthy and more gentle because like a woman is leading it. And I think the truth is that might be based on this outdated idea that like only men are the ones who are running groups like this, and therefore a woman is safer. But I think that it seems like these those are going to change, and that there could be more women cult leaders in the future. And then, I did actually just publish a very in-depth story with a colleague of mine at Bloomberg about chatbots and people who fall into delusional spirals while having, deep marathon sessions with chatting with like ChatGPT and other chatbots. And there are a lot of cult dynamics that show up in these relationships as well. And it's, in fact, someone even called it a cult of two. So it's you and ChatGPT, and you might spend hours talking to ChatGPT and you feel like you've made, a lot of these people feel like they've made a scientific breakthrough or spiritual discovery in talking with their chatbots. So you have that sense of wonder and special knowledge. And then it also isolates you from other sources of information and other relationships in your life, because naturally, if you're spending 8 to 10 hours a day chatting with ChatGPT, you are not spending that time talking to other people. And I was just surprised to see cult dynamics show up in this kind of new frontier of digital interaction and the way that people are relying on chatbots. And I believe will continue to rely on them more in the years to come for emotional support, spiritual guidance, things like that. I actually see potentially the opportunity for a whole different shape of cult dynamics to show up, which is like between you and a digital entity or like a digital conversation. So not even like humans using AI to recruit other people, but AI being the embodiment of some sort of like charismatic leader.
No, that's what's happening right now on massive scales because of supercomputers and AIs. And I'll add that there are robots that are going to be sex bots and are going to have the computer in their head and know exactly how to read you and your temperature and your heart rate, etc., and say the right things, etc. And of course, the fear is they're hackable. If anything that's got a computer can get hacked, and then who's controlling whom? And is this really, do we really want to be transhumanists? Do we really want to take our consciousness, and is it even possible to put it in an android and fly to Mars in 120 years or whatever it's going to take at the speed that we have? We're in existential new terrain. What we knew even 10 years ago, we never imagined would be where we are now. And I just really worry about state actors going, this race to who's going to have the biggest, godlike supercomputer, because then you can design ways to hack the other society, undo the electrical grids or whatever. It's just, the potential for good is so great, but without guardrails. And that's what the billionaires have been, lobbying for, and why they helped to elect Trump. They didn't want any guardrails. They didn't want any regulation. They didn't want to be responsible if people were having, anxiety attacks or gender dysmorphia or killing themselves. And we need guardrails. Technology needs guardrails. So,
well, yeah, I mean, one of the reasons that I spent all this time and energy writing Empire of Orgasm is that I really wanted readers to understand that, like you have told your audience many times, that cult dynamics exist on a spectrum and that they can show up in unusual places. And so I think that it's the story of one group, but hopefully the takeaway lesson is just how important understanding these dynamics are for everyday life and for understanding our future as well.
Yeah, exactly. Well said. Yeah, my influence continuum, I say there are cults that are ethical and productive and positive, and here they need to be giving you informed consent, and you need to respect your individuality and your conscience and be love-based and allow you to have free will and critical thinking. And the authoritarian dissociative disorder wants to create a new identity and make you alienated from who you really are, with the lie that you're going to your authentic self or your higher self, but it's really a cult-generated self. And I think if everybody has that framework, it gives them tools to go, hey, wait a minute, they lied to me when they first met them. They said it wasn't this, and now I'm seeing it's just get the frick out now. Don't stay in. Like, that's a red flag, like warning. And we're stronger together. So we need to reality test. And any group that says, don't tell your family we're meeting, or don't share you have the noose with your family. It's like, no, you need your family. You want friends. You want to create trust pods. And I think going forward, we need to remember experts that are legitimate experts based on experience, whether it's academic training, journalistic integrity, because they've gone to school and they understand how to fact check and how to evaluate sources and their credibility. They're going to be vital in the years ahead. We need to have trustworthy sources to go to for trustworthy information, and not just go on social media and believe these stories with, really attractive people that you have no idea who the hell they are, if they're even real. Now they could be AIs, right?
Yeah, unfortunately, that's a question now. Yeah.
Yeah. Final words. I'd like to do another interview with you on the whole chatbot, the whole thing, as you do that. It's hot.
It's only going to become a bigger conversation, I think.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah.
Ellen Huet, Empire of Orgasm. Buy it, get it. Did you read it? Is there an audio version as well?
I did narrate the audio version for those who are interested. So yeah, Empire of Orgasm is available now wherever you get your books, Amazon Bookshop, anywhere, hopefully your local bookstore as well. For those in or even not in San Francisco, all the copies that you get from Green Apple, which is a indie bookstore in SF, are signed by me. I will be signing all of them. And then if you'd like the copy, or if you'd like an audio version on Audible or Spotify, it is narrated by me.
Yay. Thanks again.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for having me on.
Take care.
Yep. Take care.